Hello all, Isos here. Okay, so today I am continuing on the series that I started a few weeks back regarding efficiency. So that's the non-Android efficiency series, and this is the third video in this series. This one is going to be covering allies. So in the last one, before I get started, there are timestamps in the description and comments depending on whether you're on mobile or not. And if you want to skip all this preamble, you can go straight to the assumptions, and that's when I'll start actually talking about the Marvel Champions game. But in the last one, I moved to an article and a video, and I think that worked quite well in general. But there was a lot. I did get a few comments on both the article and on the video saying that I'd missed something or that I hadn't considered something, and the reason for that was because the article was covering the actual background stuff and on like how the efficiency actually worked out and where the like balance points I thought were, whereas the video was just covering examples. And because of that, the article didn't have the example, didn't talk about particular cards, and the video didn't talk about recovery as a concept and a couple other things, because it wasn't talking about wider concepts, it was talking about particular cards, in fact almost every card. But this time I'm going to just have the article and the video have similar content. So if you prefer to read, the article should be in the description. If you prefer to watch, stay here. It's entirely up to you, but it'll mostly be covering the exact same points that I plan on that I'm making here. So with that out of the way, let's actually get started on this. So we're talking about efficiency of allies. So before then, let's just talk about assumptions, because they interact with a lot of different game mechanics. So let's just talk about the assumptions that I'm making. They're mostly based. Most of these are based off of the previous videos. So in the so the first one, the cards will be equated to resources. That's assumption I've always had to make because most cards have one resource on them. It's not strictly true. Even just drawing a card is more likely to generate a resource than generate more than one resource than the card that generates one resource. But I'm not. It just makes it so much easier to talk about things when I'm not talking about like 0.025s in value. When I need to consider the card versus the resource. So that's what that's about. The 2 damage reduced or healed is worth 1 card. That's from my last video in the series when I covered healing and damage reduced. I theorized that because recoveries are quite a high value, and the few effects that we have that replace damage for healing seem to be on 1-to-1 ratios, which is also why. And the damage video came out that I thought an unconditional 2 damage was worth about 1 card, which I think is the case. There's a few examples of effects like that, and that's also the next point there. And 1 threat removed is worth 1 card. Almost every threat removal card in the game actually sticks to this ratio. Or also with the cards being equated to resources, I'm often going to be referring to things as 1 cost more than they actually are printed on them, because the card itself that you're playing has a cost, is part of the cost effectively. Yeah, and when you consider that, almost all threat removal cards are about 1-for-1, the exception being for Justice, which is slightly better, but also it's a Justice card, it's a one-off card that's slightly better. So we're not going to worry too much about that. And villains attack for 4. This came up in the damage reduced and healed video as well, but that's actually about the average damage that you'll take from any of the villains on expert currently. I just decided to assume expert and I'm not going to talk about like a particular villain because just this number is fairly consistent. I wanted to stick with that, and it means I can more easily compare the cards and not have to worry about what scenario am I playing into at the moment. So that's the assumption. So all these are going to be assumed to be true for the entirety of this video. and probably the rest of the series, honestly. So, the next thing I'm going to get into is some definitions, because the allies do a lot of things. And because they do a lot of things, and they kind of because they stay in play, so they can have a constant effects. They have value in and of themselves with how much damage they can or fraud they can do. They can block. They can do just about. They can do just about any effect in the game, honestly. By assuming an ally got printed that had the text box of another card. So I need to define the forms of value you can get from allies. So the definitions I have here, I think are the ones I'm going to be using for this video. I'm sure there's something that you can consider, but the base value is the first one I'm considering. It's the value of the ally on its own from when you play it to when it's defeated. So this includes things like the value of the block that you're getting at the end, assuming it's cancelling a full villain attack effectively, the value of the thwarts that you get as you go along, but not the time. But I'm not considering the time frame it takes to get that value. It's just assumed that you're going to get that. It's going to sit around for long enough to get the full value. So that's the base value of an ally. So if you've ever heard someone talking about an ally saying like, "Oh, you paid 2 for it, and then it thwarts for 4 and then blocks," that would be the base value of that ally. Whereas the HP value is the value you get of 1 HP on that card, because we have the capacity to heal allies with First Aid and Med Team. More on that later, but knowing how much you can get for 1 HP can be valuable, because it allows you to not so much change the efficiency of the ally, but change the efficiency of the healing card. That healing card can be converted into another resource using allies. So that I thought was important, because some of these cards, some of these allies aren't really that good unless you're healing them. We'll get into that in a minute when I actually am talking about these various value aspects. And the engine value is the last one that I'm going into. This is the ability of the ally to create a long-term effect. So this is for things that are in play that are generating some form of an effect just by being in play, or by so they're generating some form of effect by being in play. They don't necessarily have to be generating themselves. They could be generating it based off the HP value and the healing cards that you're running, but they're able to generate something that's significantly longer than you would expect from an ally just on its own. So they're not just it's not just Black Widow, say the Black Widow ally, which we'll get into in a bit, but the Black Widow ally isn't, like, its base value of forwarding for 2 and then blocking once is not really that great for 4 cost, but its effect is an engine value effect, I would say. But any ally is going to come across in some combination of these. They're not going to be like, if a character has base value, they probably have HP value as well. If a character with high HP value probably has engine value, because you can start healing it, because you can use healing to turn that into more of a long-term effect. So they're all intertwined. They're all parts of, every ally has a section of each of this, but some of them are better at 1 or 2 of these than they are at the others, and being able to identify that could help you more likely identify what cards you want to combo with those allies, or what you want to do, how you want to play with the various cards in your deck to make the best value out of your allies. So I'm just going to continue on from here and go straight into the considerations. So I'm going to quickly go over some examples as we consider each of these values with some examples to kind of show what I'm talking about here, like how that some characters are better and worse than others at these various things, and how they're not necessarily completely linked, but we'll have a look. So base value consideration. So as I said before in the definitions, this is the value from play to defeat. So this is, you're not comboing them with anything else, you're playing them, you're getting the full value out of them, and then you're letting them take an attack and getting your value out of that as well. So Nick Fury here at 4 cost. At 4 cost is kind of expensive, but the big thing here is that he actually generates a lot of value with his ability, and then generates a little bit of value with his stat line. He actually has a pretty good HP value, but his ability makes him actually really bad at HP consideration, because you can't really reuse him multiple times in a turn. If there ever becomes a possibility that you can, he might become, you might be able to use a combo to do this, like say getting him ready and whatnot. But the reason you don't want to put, say, Inspired on Nick Fury is he's going away at the end of the turn, and generally speaking, Inspired would be a good card for HP value allies. It's just that he can't get full value out of his HP easily. So looking at this, it costs 5 cards, 4 plus the Nick Fury, and then you can either generate 3 cards, which is 3 cards worth of value. That's pretty good. Or you can remove 2 threat, that's 2 cards worth of value, or do 4 damage. 4 damage, 2 threat, they're both 2 cards worth of value. So generally speaking, you want to take the 3 cards. So you want to take the 3 cards because it's the better of the 3 options, but that's like situationally you could take one less card of value to get an effect that is more value, that is exactly what you need right now, rather than trying to risk it with the cards that you drew. So yeah, so 2 free value on this effect here, and then you've got you'll probably always thwart with him if you can. Unless you're winning the game, you're always going to thwart with him, because the 2 thwart is so much more valuable than the 2 attack. And you only get 1 of those. So that's 2 more value. So let's say we drew 3 cards, we thwarted for 2. Okay, we've generated 5 cards worth of value. That's pretty good. He costs 5, effectively 5. I would be happy with that in another card, but in Ally, you also get the block. And Nick Fury is known for that block. That one block that you get each turn with him is quite powerful, quite potent. And I said that villain attack's worth 2, and the defense is worth, sorry, that a villain attack is worth 4, is for 4 damage, and that the defense value is, for every 2 reduced, you get 1 value, so that's another 2. So he's generating 2 on top of what he already generates, which, that seems reasonable. That's like it does mean that he's above the curve versus other cards, but it's not like he's multiple times it. There's only like a 4 times multiplier, but as we'll see, that's pretty much the case for almost all allies. So Mockingbird here, this is 4, generates 2 thwart. And effectively, with the stun and the block, that's effectively 2 attacks. So that's 4. So that's 2 attacks. That would be 8 damage. That's 4 more value. So 4 plus the 2, that's 6. 6 for 4. Okay, we're starting to see a trend here. We've got a +2 multiple. In fact, when I was looking through various different things, Heimdall is 8 for 6. Hercules is difficult because of his ability reducing the cost. Daredevil's 7 for 5, alongside Nick Fury. There's a few allies that are a bit more questionable that are for combo effects that are closer to 1 to 1. but most allies seem to be about 2 above. But I have a slide on hidden costs a bit later that I think can explain why they are at that value. Anyway, Hercules is here because he's actually a pretty good base value. He could be an insane base value. If there was 6 minions in play, he's an insane base value because you're paying 1 card and getting, 9 damage and a block for 2 additional values. That's like 6.5, 6.5 value for potentially 1. Like that is it's not the highest upper end, but it's a pretty good upper end. And Hercules can. The problem is Hercules doesn't achieve that. We all know that Hercules doesn't achieve that at the moment. There's you have to just have a ludicrous number. 6 is a ludicrous number of minions to have in front of you. But that 6.5, that means that if he costs between, like, you're looking at about a 4 or 5, the equivalent, 4 or 5 is what we're looking. So we're actually looking at 3 or 4 in the actual cost on the card, resource cost. So you need 2 to 3 minions to really get value out of it. That's not completely impossible. Like, mutagen formula could easily get you 2 to 3 minions. I would say that happens to me fairly often in mutagen formula. Like, if you leave the drones out against Ultron 2 and just block his attack every turn, and then try to build up to do like a ground stomp or something to kill them all at once, you could easily have 2 or 3 minions. With Hercules out, I think once you start getting beyond that, you start having difficulty. But you start having difficulty maintaining your hit points. But he's on here to try and show that while allies are generally quite efficient, he has a decent base value and can be a decent base value. He actually has much more value when you get to the next consideration. But before we get to that, just one thing to note with these, because one of the biggest bonuses you get from these base consideration ones, when you're just focusing on the base consideration of an ally, is the fact that they can block for 2 cards of value, effectively. Because you can do that instead, they combo really well with effects that we play them. So make the call putting out Nick Fury, pretty good. Make the call putting out Mockingbird, pretty good. Like, I'm never going to feel that bad about either of those cards. Rapid Response is a similar thing. These have some pretty good base values. Losing a little bit of that value, and the fact that you've taken a damage is not that bad. Especially seeing as Rapid Response doesn't cost the cost of the ally, it costs just the 3 cards that it costs to put Rapid Response down. So yeah, these when you're talking about base consideration, they combo really well with effects that we play them, and they don't necessarily need to be high value stat lines. For instance, Shuri has a really bad stat line, but has a really good effect. She's relatively cheap. She's tutors for one of your upgrades. So that's a pretty good effect. That's a pretty good that would come under this base value. I feel like you kind of want her to just get some value and then get knocked out so that you can avoid an attack and just get that upgrade that you got. And the reason Shuri's not on here as an example is because I'm trying to avoid examples that are hero cards, because they break because there's a lot of allies, so I can talk about different ones. And hero allies generally break the curve because they're part of a set rather than just individual characters like the rest of these. Anyway, So I'm going to go into HP value consideration here. So as I mentioned with Hercules, Hercules is back on here as well, because while they're often quite good at base value as well, they're really good at turning even small healing cards into huge value. So like 2 HP on your hero, probably nothing. You may never hit that 2 HP point, so you might never have needed that small heal that you just put on yourself. But a 2 HP on an ally, which is why this is why first aid often gets played on allies, could be a huge swing. Like for example, Hercules turns 1 HP into 3 damage. So 2 HP on Hercules is 6 damage. For like first aid is effectively a 2 cost card. That is insane. Daredevil's pretty good for this as well. He turns it into 4 thwart and 2 damage, which is even more value. It's instead of 3 value, it's going to be like 5. And even just like anything with 2 thwart and 1 consequential is a pretty good baseline. So Heimdall here, 2 thwart, 1 consequential. Throw a first aid on him. He's thwarting for 4 more. That's a very good. It's much better than like any of the thwart cards we actually have, even for Justice. Obviously not as spiky as the 4 cards we currently have. Like you can't clear a big side scheme in 1 turn by first aiding a Heimdall, but over the course of the game, these options are going to get you much better thwarts totals. And Lockjaw is here because he's actually the opposite example. He is a pretty good. He's not like he's not okay. He's an okay base consideration. He's got some pretty good combo potential and engine potential, but his HP consideration is awful. He's 2 consequential with 2 attack or 2 thwart. Means the best he can really do is for 1 HP he can thwart for 1. So like first aiding him just heals you 2, and then you immediately use that to thwart again. Like it's on par with other cards, but that first aid had much higher potential value with something like Heimdall or Daredevil or even Hercules, although that would be damage, not thwart. So this is the reason when I'm building a thwart engine that is focused on first aid and allies, I don't use Lockjaw. It's a pretty obvious reason why you would do that, but I would often consider putting in something like Heimdall, being neutral and having this 2-1. Yeah, 2 thwart, 1 consequential. So yeah, the HP consideration is mostly because of the healing cards that we have, and there are some cards that are like pseudo healing, that like Honorary Avenger and Teamwork, that combo really well with HP consideration allies. Obviously these all break if you start looking at 0 HP, 0 consequential allies like Black Cat, but that's because they're actually just better as a base value consideration. The fact that they can theoretically generate infinite value, but I wouldn't worry too much about that because you know that you don't need to heal them because they're at 0 consequential damage. I'm going to move on to engine value considerations here. So these typically last forever. So if a card has a good engine value consideration, it has the capacity to last forever. If you had enough healing in your deck, you could actually consider a good HP value ally to be a engine value consideration. This is what I was talking about with the thwart engine before. So for instance, I actually use Black Widow often in protection decks, alongside Heimdall or the hero's signature ally, to make a thwart engine out of that can actually work in protection, because protection has no capacity to remove threat directly. So but has a decent capacity for healing allies. So these can be used for that because you'll heal them every other turn or so, depending on how much healing you have in the deck. Kind of determines how many of these you can use. But you heal them every other turn. They fought for two a turn for the entirety of the game. Like, that is a possibility of an engine that you should consider. So looking at these ones actually have all of these actually have really awful base considerations. Nova is capable of doing 4 damage and blocking once, so he's capable of generating 4 cards of value for 5 cost. Black Widow can fort for 2 and block once, so that's 4 cards of value for 4 costs. Quake is 2 damage and a block for 2, so 3 for 3. And Tigra's can attack one additional time for 2, so it's 4 for 4 again. Like, these base considerations are just awful. But Black Widow has a good HP consideration, but all these cards I would say are still pretty good. Tigra I've kind of fallen off of just because aggression just has too much ability to kill minions, but Nova can't kill. Nova's in a aspect that can't kill minions, and this effect becomes really powerful. And similar with Quake. So these all have the capacity to generate value every single turn. So Nova, he allows you to turn energy resources into it's only like 1-to-1, so it's like 1 card of value into 1 card of value. So it's not like an insane trade here, but this is an engine. This lets you build. You now have this ability to turn energy into damage, which you didn't have before you put Nova on the table. Quake is the capacity to Quake and Tigra are both the capacity to remove allies that you couldn't remove before. Tigra just doing it in general, and Quake doing it when you flip to Alter Ego to let them scheme. Like, these have the capacity to last forever. They have the capacity to generate value every turn for the entire course of the game. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about engine value or engine allies. Okay, so I said I'd mention hidden costs. So when we're looking at the base value allies, the ones that are quite good just from being played, I said that they seem to fall into this line where you generate about 2 cards worth of resources more than you actually about 2 cards of resources more than you actually paid, which would be quite strong and make them stronger than like every single other card type. But these 2 considerations have a cost. There is a real thing going on here in the background. Uniqueness, obviously not as big a deal if you're all playing different aspects, but you can't have 2 players with the same ally in play, and the variance increases because there's only 1 in the deck. This, I think, is not really that big a deal. You can always find your unique stuff, or your unique allies, and make them work, but it means that it is increasing the variance. It definitely is increasing the variance, and that in multiplayer there is the consideration that only one of you can have it. Like, you may not be able to generate full value off of your Mockingbird because someone else needs to play Mockingbird so that they can generate the value out of it as well. So you can lose some of the value that you were generating because you have this uniqueness, and you have to sacrifice your ally earlier so that you can actually work around the uniqueness. But I think the bigger deal is the ally limit. So you might notice I have the 2 ally limit cards on the right here. It's fairly expensive to raise the ally limits. Like, both of these cards are also unique, and they are also like 2 cost for a card that all it does is raise the ally limit by 1, and Avengers Tower is 3 cost, but I suppose you also get a discount, so it's it has more and less value. Assuming more value when you have like all Avengers allies, but then you have to run all Avengers allies. But anyway, so it's expensive to raise, and there's very few options to actually do that. They're both on the screen. I would... Okay, so I say to treat it as a resource generated each turn. I don't mean a resource as in a card, a resource on a card that you're using to pay for other cards. I mean, this is a resource in like the game aspect. Like you have 3 ally limits to use every turn, and by playing an ally and keeping that ally in play, you're using that resource every turn. If you're not at your ally limits, that resource is going to waste. But if you're but it also constrains you if you end up with too many allies. You can't get full value out of them. So you start having to give up value on some of the allies to properly make use of this ally limit resource. So that I think is the biggest cost of allies. I think that's what keeps them at least a little bit in check. They are still very valuable. You'll notice that most decks are running at least a few, generally somewhere around the 5-6 mark. But these costs here are what keeps you from running, say, a 40 card deck full entirely of allies. Assuming the hero comes out that has 15 allies as their signature set. Like, uniqueness and ally limits are the costs that allow allies to be a little bit above the curve, that the 2 cards of value above the curve without completely breaking the game. Particularly those, like the 2 cost allies, the 2 3 cost allies, they're generating like 5 by that consideration, they would generate about 5 resources, 5 cards of value, and 3 for 5 is a pretty big difference as opposed to 5 for 7. But these things keep them in check. These are what's you're paying with these, not with resources, which is what I think which is how I think the allies are balanced a bit, and the reason why we don't see people just slapping every single ally in the deck anymore, because I don't think it's that efficient, because the ally limit stops it from being that efficient, which is like a good point in design for ally limit, honestly. But after this, okay, so that's where I'm at with just the general like efficiency of allies at the moment. So if going forward, I'm going to be talking about support cards. They are, so not like cards that support allies, not the type of card. So unlike other types of cards, like your damage events and whatnot, the allies have cards that interact with them for more interesting effects. So that's what I'm talking about with the support cards here. And I'm just going to be going into a few like broad categories, and leadership, like basically every leadership card is a support card for an ally. Like, we know that leadership focuses on allies, and that's what it's good at, and that ends up being there'll be quite a few leadership cards in the next couple slides here. So first one, cards that put things into play. So I mentioned this before with base value allies. These are really good when used with base value allies, because they they basically emulate that situation where you get the full value, and then allow you to get it a second time. Although rapid response does have a little bit of a drawback because it puts a damage on there. So if you had someone that had like 5 for 1 consequential, but only only like 1 or 2 hit points, you'd not really be able to use rapid response on it. At 1 hit point, you wouldn't be able to use it at all. At 2, you'd be able to use it a little bit, but only for another block. But these are really good with base value allies. Like the Make the Call in particular, Make the Call typically, there's only like one ally it matters with, that it doesn't do this. Make the Call typically does the exact same effect as if you'd played it from hand, besides the cost and not being able to reduce it. And that's so if you have a really high value of value on your ally from play all the way to the defeat, and then you get that same value again, which you can with Make the Call. That's if you can make that higher or a higher proportion, that means it's even more efficient. So I don't really need to talk about how good Make the Call and Rapid Response is for that long. I'm sure most people watching this have seen or played with one or both of these cards, and they are very efficient cards. But this is why you would want to make the call for a Nick Fury or a Mockingbird. You probably don't really want to make the call for Tigra as much. It's still a consideration, but like you'd get more value out of the higher base value allies. So healing, I mentioned this a lot when we were talking about the HP values. Whenever you can give them more hit points somehow. So examples: healing, or teamwork is a pseudo heal of 1, and also the Honorary Avenger, by increasing the hit points by 1, is also a pseudo heal of 1. You can get you can get 1 more of the HP value of that ally. So this can lead to some really outrageous trade values. I mentioned before using First Aid on a 2-fort character to get 4 fraught. Like, that's using 2 costs to get 4. That's unrivaled in the fraught sphere. Not quite unrivaled. There's Superhuman Law Division from She-Hulk can achieve it, but it's like the only card. Which is why I say they're typically best on good fraught characters, because fraught has a lower cap, generally speaking. But other options here, like First Aid on Hercules, is 6 damage. That's pretty good for 2 cost as well. And that's like a embiggened big hands. It's like the only thing that's even equivalent to that. And you can also achieve that with some other, with some more like combo-y effects, which I'll get into in the next slide. Oop. So engine and combo. So this isn't talking about engine allies. Like the engine allies, I feel like that's when you're looking at an ally in and of itself. What can it do for you? This is so like sometimes you can build an engine that doesn't use any of those engine allies. For instance, the strength in numbers that I've got listed here. It just requires Avengers. All of those allies could be good base value cards. They could be good base value cards. You could just be sacrificing them every turn and then playing another one because there's so many allies by that point, by whatever point you're playing the game. And they don't have to be engine allies to fully make use of strength in numbers, but it will turns them into a draw engine, which turns your allies into draw engine. That's pretty good. you can also use these to create an engine out of a non-engine ally. So the example here, the reason I've got Enrage and Teamwork on this page, um, Enrage is not very efficient. You're typically trading 2 damage. You're typically getting 2 damage at the cost of a hit point, which means that you're losing whatever you would have got from that hit point, which is probably 1 to 2. Like best case, that was only 1 to 2 damage, and worst case, that was that you may you can get significantly worse cases than that. But it also costs 2 cards to put it down, so you've invested more into the ally, and you're going to get less out of it generally. But you can use this alongside Teamwork to get the value of that HP multiple times. So Teamwork with Enraged on, say, Wonder Man, you could actually stack Wonder Man up to like 6 damage with just the cards that a 6 attack character. You would only be able to use him once naturally, so you'd only be able to discard 1 card to get him to attack once, because then he'd be on 1 hit point. But then every single Teamwork you have for the rest of the game could legitimately be a plus 6 damage attack. And that's a pretty big deal for 1 card. So this is what I'm talking about with engine and combo. You're building up to bigger effects from lesser value cards, generally. So your your strength in numbers, that card is costing you whatever your allies were going to generate that turn, delaying it by an extra turn. But it's gaining you all those cards that you didn't have, and that's a much higher value. This Enraged Teamwork combo could generate a lot of value. I don't think we're quite there yet. You could do it in multiplayer, and there's possibly some value in that, but this is more of a long-term thing that I'm thinking about. This is like, these combos could come out down the line. It might not be specifically Enraged Teamwork. There might be some other card that comes out that allows you to get more value than out of something that you would generally have considered to not really be all that efficient. You got to be careful about going too deep into this, like to really deep combos. Like if you're trying to set up like a 12 card combo and it doesn't win you the game, you're probably not getting enough value out of the lesser value cards that you're considering. But there are support cards like Enraged and Teamwork. Actually, Enraged and Teamwork, these 3 cards down the bottom here, I think are perfect examples of what I'm talking about here. They create an engine. Strength in numbers pretty much by itself, but the other 2, they have the possibility to do stuff that you couldn't normally do. And because of that, you should consider whether that's right for your deck, but it's never going to be right for any particular deck. It's never going to be right for a generalized deck. It's always going to be right for that particular deck. So you're not going to set up an Enraged Teamwork combo because Enraged and Teamwork exist. You're going to set it up because Enraged and Teamwork happen to work in your deck very well. Anyway, that's enough on engine, combo play, etc. So I'm going to do some case studies. So I did this in the first video. I don't believe I did this in the second one because I kind of went over every card anyway. But I'm going to talk about just particular cases that I thought were fairly interesting to show what how you can actually evaluate allies. And I know I mentioned that I wasn't going to talk about any hero cards, but I'm going to talk about She-Hulk's signature ally. So I'm proving that I can't talk for 30 minutes without speaking about She-Hulk. Um, anyway, let's just jump right into that. This is the case study for Hellcat. So at the just standard base value, she seems pretty good as a base value / HP value ally, like 2 fort, 1 consequential. It's exactly the stat line I said to look out for HP value. But she's also got 3 hit points, so we're looking at 4 forts and then a defense, so that's like 6 value. So that's for 4 total cards cost. So that's like that's that +2 that I was talking about before, that a lot of the good base value allies get to. But I actually like her most, not as a good base value ally, but as a amazing engine ally. Her first play is on par with non for justice cards when it comes to removing threat. It costs you 4 and you remove 4 threat. That's okay. But every subsequent one, it costs you 3 and gets you 4 threat removed. So that's the same as playing for justice, but she also has the option to be discounted more easily, because she's affected by Avengers Tower and she's affected by Quinjet. Which are 2 cards that can't affect for justice, and every discount that affects for justice that She-Hulk has access to doesn't also can affect Hellcat. There's no play foreign events that are available to the general public. There's only the one in Miss Marvel. So this means that you can actually use Hellcat as a thwart engine by herself by just spending resources on her every other turn, and you can use some use some cards that affect her uniquely versus other thwarting cards to allow for that to be a little bit cheaper, because it is kind of expensive to spend 3 every turn, just to keep your thwart package online. But you can get a pretty high value of thwarts per turn from this, and that I thought was something that was interesting, particularly as it gives a pretty good case for like base value versus engine. Next case I'm going to be talking about is Hulk. He has the potential to be a really good base value without attacking. If they actually hit for 4 or 3 or 2 or 1 or 0, his block he'll be able to block 2 attacks, and if they hit for 4, that means that you've blocked 2 value worth of attack, and then you get another 2 value worth of attack next turn. That's pretty good. Right, that's 4 for 3. Like, it's not the best, but at least it's some value, and he's relatively cheap, and he's blocking an attack. It's just awkward if you get hit for that exact 5. It's obviously not the best use for Hulk. I have been known to include him for that purpose, but it's just because in aggression there's not a lot of damage mitigation available to you. The best use for Hulk is obviously to attack with him, which makes him incredibly variable because he's discarding randomly off the top of your deck, and you do not know what that is currently. So the variation is entirely based off your deck composition and what's in play. So if you had every single mental resource card in play, you can actually have a really good, really consistent Hulk going off every turn. But that is difficult to do in general. And you got to be careful with energy resources as well. But there's some important things here. He actually has a really high upper end. If you hit physical every single turn, or energy when there's a bunch of minions, or I'm not going to worry about the energy because it goes higher than this, because it's hits everything. But the if you hit physical every turn, you'll do 25 damage, and that's actually better than blocking if you can guarantee that you've got the physical on the 5th, and that's 12.5 cards of value. You could and you can trade, like if you can guarantee that you're going to hit physical every time, you could heal him. You'd need like a physical healing card, which is not available currently, but let's say you have it, you're from the future, you have a physical healing card. You can trade the 1 healing for 5 damage. That's pretty good. Like, that means first aid would be like 10 damage. I talked about how good it was with 6. The upper end on Hulk is very good. This is why in my solo deck prime I talked about him being an archetype that we saw, but it doesn't really happen anywhere near as much anymore. But that may not be the case forever. We could very well end up with Hulk decks going forward. It's just getting to consistently hit at or near this upper case is really difficult. It's almost impossible to build a deck that is almost entirely physical, so that the Hulk can trigger like this. So we might need some. So we can either continue trying that, or maybe there'll be some support some other way to achieve a similar level of result. Because the flip side of that is the low end is really bad. He generates 1.5 cards of value at the cost of 3 cards. That's like playing Haymaker as playing Haymaker on the villain as your primary damage source. Like, Haymaker, obviously, the value of Haymaker is generally to kill a minion so that you can keep going. But yeah, this is just insanely low value. It's so little and like he's unique and taking up an ally slot. Well, not for long, because this is when he hits a mental resource on his first attack. So you got So you've got this this really big, wide spread of what Hulk can do, and I think that was an interesting case to look at, because it's just an interesting ally in general. Continuing on, I'm going to look at Wonder Man. So Wonder Man, I'm looking at Wonder Man and Vision. The reason I'm looking at these two is they're 2 cards that you don't really get full value out of unless you pay more into them. So Wonder Man and I thought they were an interesting contrast between one another. So Wonder Man actually gets the most value when you don't actually use Wonder Man to attack. So I'm not saying like use his frauds, I'm saying you're not using this ally, you're triggering some other effect. So the best example is Teamwork. As I mentioned before, Wonder Man has the highest attack stat of printed attack stat of any ally that we currently have. So putting Inspired and Enraged on him actually means that his attack stat is higher than any other ally can get to, almost. The Vision can theoretically get 1 more, but Vision would have to pay for that every turn, whereas Wonder Man can just sit there and be ready for you to teamwork whenever it comes up. So that's why I say he's strong with combo effects. So he's really strong with strength in numbers as well, because he's an Avenger. So he can fit into the full 5 Avengers lineup, so he can strengthen numbers for more. And like you just don't really want to pay for him to attack, so you just strengthen numbers and take an extra card instead. You're now up one card instead of down one, but you didn't get the free damage, obviously. And yeah, so he's strong with combo effects because if you look at his actual base value, he costs 4. So 3 by base, so 5 once you discard cards to allow him to attack twice. That allows him to generate 3 cards of value, and then he blocks for 2. So that's 5 cards of value at the cost of 5 cards. You don't have that like +2 that you have on a lot of the other base value ones. Which is why you need the combo effects to make him either into an engine or to get more effect out of him than you would normally. He's also awful with ready effects. I'm not particularly fond of ready effects in general, but get ready on Wonder Man is atrocious. You spend an extra card, you then have to spend another card to get into attack again. It's not where you want to be. But despite all that, I actually quite like Wonder Man because these combos with teamwork and strength and numbers are pretty okay to pretty strong. And he's just low cost for this attack stat is just works out really well in the grand scheme of things. Whereas Vision, I'm just going to come out and say it, I don't like Vision as a card. I do not normally include Vision in any of my decks. I have been known to add him into energy heavy decks, energy heavy leadership decks, to try and get value out of him, but I feel like he combos with cards that I A, don't like, and B, don't really want to play. That's kind of synonymous. Like I don't the cards he combos with, I don't feel like they have the support in the allies to justify their inclusion. Because he's really good with ready effects, and as I said, and I don't really like Get Ready to start with. But anyway, let's just quickly talk about him. By base, he's 5 cards for 4 cards of value. He's actually negative on the value. Like Nova's also negative, but Nova gives you an option that you didn't have before and can generate infinite value. Whereas Vision can't, because he needs to use his stats and thus take consequential damage in order to properly be used. He's able to trade 1 card for 1 or 2 value of effect. So he can either put his fort up to 3, getting the 2 value, or he can put his attack up to 4, getting the 1 value, because attack is not worth as much as fort. But this does mean that he has the potential to be the highest attack ally in the game currently. But the fact that you have to spend an extra resource to get there means that teamwork is costing you 1 extra to get 1 damage. It's not. I don't think it's worth it. I think Wonder Man's a better case for that. Anyway, if you want him to hit the efficiency of other cards, he actually needs to be readied. You need ready effects, and ready effects don't just speed up the use of your allies. They don't get you more uses out of your allies, generally speaking. We'll see if that continues going forward, but Get Ready is not actually giving you more value out of that card. It's just meaning that you can free up your ally limit a little bit quicker. And you need ready effects so that you don't have to pay the extra resource. So it actually. So he needs a ready effect just to get to the 5 for 5 value. Sorry, it'll be 6 for 6 value, I'm pretty sure. But he needs a ready effect just to get to that, and that's the efficiency of other cards. Allies are generally more efficient than other cards because they have those hidden costs that I mentioned earlier. So Vision, to get to that beyond that point, needs to go even more combo-y, which means he needs more cards to combo with him, and I don't think we have those cards currently. So Vision might be core in a deck down the line, but I don't think he's. I think at this point most leadership decks have already cut him, and these are the reasons why, and this is part of what I'm talking about with like part of the reason why I'm talking about efficiency like this is so that we can evaluate cards like Vision, who can feel really good. Like slap an Inspired on him, attack twice for 5 each. That's 10 damage, and like all you really spent was like 2 cards. But that turn at least. But you've spent a lot of cards in the past to make that work, and it doesn't. I feel like the combo with some other character, like for instance Wonder Man, with the Teamwork Enraged shenanigans, would be more. So he needs to have more combo effects that work with him in order to be comparable. Anyway, so quickly, conclusions. So obviously I've just finished up with what I was going to talk about for today. So their allies generate about 2 cards of value higher than the cost of the card. So that means that they're generally generating more resources of value than other card types. But the reason for this is the fact that they're taking up an ally limit, which is a resource that you have to actually consider, and those slots are very limited. And long term, it's not as big a deal at the moment. It's starting to feel like it's a bigger deal because we're starting to have enough allies that you can fill it easily. But the over the grand total of the game, if you're watching this, say 2 years from now, you probably have a better understanding that we don't just slap every single ally in the deck for a reason. And that's because there are additional costs. That's the ally limit. That's what I was talking about before. At the moment, it feels like a given to take allies. This is a conclusion. I'm going to state this. I think that it's a given that your deck, if you're looking for the best deck that you could possibly make, it's a given that your deck has some allies in it. Not just because you have to take one at the moment because we don't have any heroes that don't have one, but because the options that we have are too efficient for the cost. But if you take too many, you lose out on value because you won't be able to play them. And if you just can't, and a dead card effectively only has the value of the resources that it's worth, that it has on the printed in the bottom left, which is for every ally 1. So if you add just too many allies, you're losing out on that value. So if you had 3 infinite engine allies, like they're just sitting there, they're just going to sit there forever, and you put in a 4th ally, that character, it better be there for a good reason. It's got to be there for something that you really need early on to get to the board state where you have 3 engine allies. Otherwise, it's probably just a wasted slot because those 3 allies will be in play instead. And the last thing, they have a higher potential value than most other card types. Like this fact that they're generating about 2 higher value than most other, and the support cards like First Aid being able to convert really favorably into other effects, gives them possibly the highest potential value out of any card type, but it's not. We're not going to be able to reach that all the time or with every deck or anything like that. Like, you're definitely going to want to include non-allies in your deck, and just understanding the value of each ally that you've picked and each ally slot that you have is something that I think is valuable to people overall. But anyway, this has been me talking about the allies for an hour. Hopefully, if you've made it this far, hopefully that's been quite useful. If not, let me know. But I would appreciate any feedback in the comments or anything you feel I've missed. Obviously, I didn't go through all the examples. There are a lot of allies. The fact they're unique means that we often end up getting quite a few in a pack. And there's obviously all the hero allies, which can break these molds a little bit because hero cards are generally slightly stronger. But this hopefully is at least a little bit helpful, and I shall see you next time.